Great. Well, welcome everyone to GPLH's webinar on grant budgets. I am introducing Eric Roth, who's not with us today, but he did record his presentation. Eric is a longstanding GPLH board member. He's currently the Associate Director of Development and Grants at Mohonk Preserve. Eric has over 25 years experience in nonprofit and fundraising work, and he's worked as a grant writer for Orange County Community College, the SUNY Orange, and Choice Words. He currently serves as the GPLH Mentoring Program Chair and has been a grant reviewer with the New York State Archives. And one thing before we get his recording going, which should be about 20-25 minutes, he did know after he sent it, and he was very apologetic about this, there is a small calculation error in one of his slides. So I won't tell you where it is. It's very small. Obviously, we want our calculations to be correct when we submit grants, but look for that. And then at the end, we'll see if anybody spotted it. All right, Maureen, if you want to play that.
Can you hear it? I can't hear it, so hold on. Something's wrong.
I promise you all, we just tested this and we heard it.
It just worked. It worked a minute. Yeah. Huh. All right. Hold on. I'm just going to stop it and start again. Maybe I started too soon. I'm just making sure that my volume is up to the max, and it is. Why is this not working? Nothing, right?
I don't see Eric speaking.
No, nothing's happening.
But it's actually not the first slide either.
No, I know.
So
that.
we should hear him. Do you want me to try to do it from my machine?
Well, let's see. Here we go.
This is a typical
Here we go.
scenario.
There we go.
Excellent.
Program person comes to you and says, help, I need this stuff, do this thing. I think it costs about this much. As a grant writer, I do a quick analysis. I ask, mission related? Is it at least partially in the budget of the organization? Can I turn this idea into a true grant project that would be competitive for a grant funder? Grant writers hear these requests all the time. It's our job to take these simple requests for a piece of equipment or a couple of supplies and turn it into a more sophisticated budget that embeds all kinds of costs for the organization, helping it out on a much larger basis. Program staff that comes to you with these types of requests, they understand the on-the-ground needs. They understand the needs and the wants of the people that are going to benefit from this program. Leadership, on the other hand, understands how the project supports the organization's goals and sometimes the bigger picture of what the organization is trying to accomplish. Funders have a keen interest in how their money helps people, and they really want their money to be used wisely and effectively to help as many people as they can and in as judicious a way as possible. Grant writers understand how to communicate between all of these people. Good grant budgeting is how we do it. The next several slides will ask the big why questions. Why do grant writers spend all this time thinking about grant budgets and these little costs and these big costs, and how do we organize them in different ways? The first answer to this question is because we want to make the grant funders happy. We want to give them confidence that we understand the full cost of the project and that their money will be used wisely. The second big why to grant budgeting is we want to make our leadership happy. Running a nonprofit organization is not the easiest job in the world. We want to make sure that our executive director, president, or our board chair has the confidence that grants are helping the organization to achieve its financial goals as well as its mission and strategic goals. Third big why of grant budgeting is to make staff and beneficiaries happy. A good grant budget will help to expand the organization's capacity. It'll provide staff with equipment, supplies, and conferences or trainings, things that will help them to do their job better and provide better services to the audiences that they serve. The next several slides deal with the big practical questions of grant budgeting. And the first is how much to ask for in the first place. Figuring out how much to ask for in a grant is not always intuitive. Grant funders use a number of methods to figure this out. In addition to funder research and the obvious cost of the project, we look at a number of factors to try to fine-tune our budget so that it would meet everybody's needs. And that includes the leadership, it includes the funder, it includes the program staff, and especially the audience and beneficiaries. The second big practical question of grant budgeting is how to increase your grant application's competitiveness. A good and sophisticated grant budget will give you an edge over applicants with simpler budgets. It will show the grant funder that you understand their guidelines and their intent, and it'll give them confidence that their money will be well spent. The third big practical question for grant budgeting is how do we use grant budgets to help our organization's bottom line? Counter to common belief, grant budgets do not inherently help an organization's finances. It is the result of good planning that ensures that a grant helps an organization's finances. Good budgeting ensures that a grant helps the bottom line rather than hurts it. And yes, that sometimes happens. I had one leader at a nonprofit I used to work at that would say, grants are the gifts that keep taking. Now, obviously, that's not what we want. By good planning, good attention to detail, we can ensure that grants are the gifts that keep giving. The fourth of our big practical questions for grant budgeting is how do we design grants to be easy to manage once we win the award? Setting up your grant budget to make post-award expense tracking and reporting go smoothly is a bit of a skill. Now that we've covered the basics of grant budgeting, including the big why and practical questions, we can take the rest of the presentation to dive into the details. This first slide covers important terms and concepts that you need for grant budgeting. The first is total project cost. Grants rarely cover the entire cost of the project. The total project cost is the amount of the grant plus the additional project cost the organization will incur to carry out the work. The ask amount, simply enough, is the amount that you're going to ask the funder to give. The match or cost share is the amount that your organization contributes to the project above the grant amount, or at least how much you report to the funder of that cost. Sometimes it makes sense to keep some true project costs out of an official grant budget, although you should have a sense about what those are at least. Splitting project costs between grant and match is more of an art than a science. Sometimes the funder provides guidelines, either full or partial. Other times you have to make an educated guess based on your research and your organization's needs. It is pretty common for a grant funder to require a 1-to-1 or 50% match. In that sense, you are giving half of the total project cost, and the grant funder is supporting half of the total project cost. There are other ratios that they provide, that they require too. It's different for each grant. So how exactly do you determine how much to ask for in a grant? Grant writers use a number of different methods to arrive at this number. By examining the funder's history, we can get a good idea of how much the funder tends to give to organizations and projects like ours. I would say don't necessarily just ask for the maximum. Look at your project, look at other projects like it, and find a good middle ground. From that, that'll give you a good ballpark number that you can work within your grant budget. Then you'll balance this against the total project cost and the required or competitive, in some cases, match amount. If the grant requires a certain match, you need to make sure you at least provide that amount. If you think the grant's going to be competitive and that by giving a little more match to the project that it might help for competitiveness, then you may want to do that. From there, then you calculate the net gain of the grant for your organization and see if you can fine tune the budget a little more to help your bottom line. So remember that mock scenario we did way back in the beginning of this presentation when the librarian came to the grant writer and said, help, I need to buy some stuff so I can do a public program series. I need a projector, I need a laptop, I need a screen. And I said that the grant writer came up with a more sophisticated budget that spread the costs or embedded a bunch of other costs into the project, cover the costs over the entire year. So we're going to show how that happens, this mock budget. So the first thing you'll notice is that we have 4 columns. We have description of expense, we have grant, match, and total. The grant column is how much we are asking the funder for per line item. The match is how much the organization is contributing. In this case, the library is contributing to the project per line item. And then the total is the total project cost. So in this case, our grant ask amount is $10,000. Our match amount is $5,130, and our total project cost is $15,130. You can see the line items, honoraria, the people that we're going to ask to give these presentations over the course of a year. There's personnel costs, that's the costs of the librarian's time to carry out this project. There's equipment, there's software, there's supplies, printing, postage, publicity, and refreshments. You'll notice first this red circle under or around TEC. That is total employment cost. That is salary plus fringe. We'll talk about that a little later down the line. So note that the grant lines are split between grant and match, not always evenly. This helps with expense tracking and reporting and not having to ask for budget revisions later. It also shows the grant funder that we're thoughtful about making sure that the grant funds are supporting the costs that they're going to be most interested in, but that we're also recognizing the other costs that go into this project. I also like to put the messiness into the match column. Messiness, for example, you'll see in the 3rd line down, the equipment is $2,450. So the 2,000 goes straight into the grant line. That's a nice clean number. 450 goes into the match because we want to make sure we get that grant number at $10,000 because that's what the grant funders used to spending on these types of projects. So then I throw all the other, like I said, the messy cost, $100, $200, $450, $350. We put that in the match line. Now we will calculate the budget relief or net gain of our grant. This is the amount of the grant that helps our bottom line, helps our organization's bottom line, or our financial bottom line, puts us in the black, if you will. So this is a different calculation than our grant budget. You'll notice that the columns are different. So we still have description of expense. We have the total project cost, which is $15,130. But instead of grant versus match, we have expenses that are in our annual operating budget, in budget, and new expense or out of budget expense. So our in budget expenses are $6,060. I believe that's what that is. And our new expense is $3,070. So if you look here in the in budget column, all the expenses are in budget except for the items that our librarian wanted specific for this project. The $2,450 in equipment, the software bundle, that's $200, supplies, that's $420. So all of that was not put into the budget. That was not expected expense. They put together the annual budget. So we take that number, that $3,070, and we subtract it from the grant amount.
I think when you muted everybody, he muted as well.
Yeah, you muted me. Sorry,
I
guys.
did that.
Yeah.
I did that. I
can't mute me.
apologize.
Yeah, if you hit mute everybody, it'll mute him too.
So if you mute everybody and then I'll unmute myself.
Yeah, I caught that.
Yeah, I didn't mute everyone, but I did think I was just looking to see who wasn't muted, so I apologize.
So
Are you able to, you've unmuted, so
I've
we can go,
unmuted,
right?
but yeah, mute everybody again and I'll unmute myself.
Okay.
Okay.
So we can say the $10,000 grant, that's all well and good, but we're only realizing $6,930 in extra income for the organization. The value is still $10,000. Actually, the value is $15,000. But so that you could say the value of the grant is $10,000. The net gain is $6,930. Now let's look at the specifics of all the different line items that we can put into a grant. The first category here is people, and the first subcategory here is employees. So when you're writing a grant, you can add, a lot of grants will allow you to add in personnel costs. That's the time that your staff puts into a grant project. And what's really important here is when you put in that time and you calculate the cost of that time, you're not only including salary, you're including the total employment cost. So that's salary plus fringe. So make sure to include the entire fringe package when you put that number in, if the funder allows it, of course. The fringe package typically includes retirement, medical, disability, workers' compensation, FICA, etc. And you can usually get this number from your business office. I often just use one hourly number per employee that includes both salary and all of these fringe costs. Fringe is often 25% or more of an employee's cost to an organization. So if you just did the salary, you're kind of missing out on some costs that you put into your grant to help you ask for more money and then also help your bottom line. Some funders want you to split the salary and fringe and report it that way, but most will accept them combined, as I just described. So also notice that full-time and part-time, perhaps you contract employees, they will all have very different fringe rates. If a full-time staff member has a 25 or 30% fringe rate, a part-time probably have about a 10% fringe rate, maybe less. So when estimating the hours that these employees are going to work on the project, be realistic. Do not overestimate. You're going to need to track all these hours. And I'm telling you, there's a lot of headaches to be had if you're going to just put in more hours than an employee can reasonably put into the project. Employees are notorious for not always tracking their hours very efficiently. A lot of times you're going to have to chase them down to make sure they put those hours in their timesheet and provide the right documentation. So, maybe estimating carefully can save you a lot of scrambling and or headaches, especially as you're heading toward the end of the project and you need to submit your final report. For consultants and contractors and legal and engineering costs, design costs, planning costs for capital projects, you will probably need to include their estimates or their proposals with your application. In some cases, even the signed contracts between your organization and these outside personnel. Again, these are often called soft costs in capital projects, not so much the contractors, but the consultants and the legal and the engineering, all that stuff. So I just wanted to make sure you're aware of that term, soft costs, because you may see that. The next cost category is stuff. Grant funders tend to love to fund stuff, even more than people. Actually, probably a lot more than people. Anyway, stuff costs are kind of self-explanatory. We're talking about equipment, materials, supplies, printing, signs, fees, licenses, permits, software, publicity. And there's probably a lot more that I'm not thinking about. And these costs are pretty self-explanatory for the most part. The art is in knowing how to group items together in your budget in a way that makes sense and doesn't give you too much work to do after the fact, after grant award anyway. So some grants will want you to describe these costs in a lot of detail, sometimes item by item even. Others want you to group things together and they value a lot of brevity. So you have to kind of suss that out from the grant funder themselves, see if their guidelines provide the guidance for what you need to make those decisions. Generally, I like to group like items together whenever I can. I tend to provide a lot more detail about expensive items, less detail about less expensive items. Those are general rules, but again, each funder is different. And again, if you're writing a $100,000 grant, you're going to provide a different level of detail than you're going to provide about, say, a $1,000 grant. In a $1,000 grant, the funder may want you to list every single item, even if it's only, $10 or so. And a $100,000 grant, that's rarely going to be the case. Our third cost category here is just simply other. Basically anything that doesn't fit into either people or stuff. This includes travel, lodging when you're traveling, per diem, which is food and drink when you're traveling, going to conferences, the registration costs, trainings, professional development, space costs, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and indirect costs, which is very much its own animal. So for travel, you can mostly just use standard mileage costs. I think it's what, 65 cents per mile. And you can calculate the amounts of these yourself using Google Maps or some similar app. Flights, hotel costs, food and drink, all these are pretty common in grants if the funder allows them. Some grants allow you to also include your building, rent, utilities, or even a per square footage rate in your grant budgets. This is what I'm calling space costs. Indirect costs refer to a percentage of total project cost that some government agencies and other funders allow you to add into your grant budget. Typically, these will fall into a 10% or a 20% range, but sometimes government grants can go higher. I've seen them as much as 30 or even 35%. So government indirect cost rates can be complicated and perhaps enough to warrant an entire presentation devoted to them. Organizations will specifically negotiate their indirect cost rate with a government funder, and they'll use those for all grants. But again, specifically, if you have a $10,000 grant, you're allowed a 10% indirect cost rate. So now your project cost becomes $10,000 plus the 10%. That 10%, sometimes you'll split that between the grant and the match lines. Sometimes you'll put them in one or the other. At this point, you're probably not going to have too much experience with it, but it's important to just know the term indirect cost, and that will require a fair amount of research if that comes into play. There are a few other terms and concepts that I want to touch on here in relation to grant budgeting. The first is budget justification, which is a narrative that you provide describing your budget. Sometimes it's also referred to as budget detail. Sometimes the grant funder will embed this into their budget form. Other times they just say, they'll give you a 1,000-character limit to describe it. It's where you're going to describe how you arrived at these costs. If you want to provide detail for what your personnel costs are, who your employees are, that type of thing. If you're putting a big number in, say, supplies, say a couple $1,000s for supplies, in your budget narrative or budget justification, you can list all of those items. So per costs refer to how much the grant supports each project beneficiary. For example, if a $10,000 grant for a project serves 1,000 people, you would have a per beneficiary cost of $10. Grant funders like to see this. It shows them how their grant is supporting each person who's going to benefit from the grant. It can help your competitiveness to include this. So capital versus operating. Operating refers to standard organizational costs like personnel, supplies, travel, etc. These costs are covered in your annual operating budget. Capital cost refers to large equipment, land, or construction costs. They're accounted for differently, and most organizations treat them in a separate budget. This is pretty important when you're calculating net gain of the grant, because if the capital expenses are treated in a different budget, the operating are in another budget, you have to kind of make sure you understand those. As far as rounding goes, you can round both up and down, and that's pretty okay within reason in a grant budget. You know, sometimes it's just, you don't want to show all those 99s, 76s, 34, you know, the dollar amount and the cents amounts. You don't always need to show those. Use good basic judgment. You know, typically, you know, you round to the nearest 100, maybe the nearest 1,000 in some cases, depends on how big the grant is. Again, use your good judgment. I like to round down sometimes, which is helpful host award to ensure that your grant match funds get spent. I just kind of think of it as coverage in case my staff doesn't always report the hours the way they should, or maybe they don't spend the money and the grant the way they were supposed to. Believe me, this sort of thing happens. And you wouldn't think that it does, but it does. Anyway, whenever I round down, I like to say any overage in the grant line will be swept into the match. That kind of gives you the coverage you need for that. And of course, you know, expense tracking is a term in and of itself, and that refers to how you were tracking the expenses after the grant award for reporting purposes. So this is done on top of what your business office does. I like to create a spreadsheet for every grant I have, and I track these expenses, and then I match that up against what the business office has at the end of a grant. That ensures that my numbers are going to meet their numbers, and that whatever we report to the grant funders are going to be kosher and accurate and make our auditors happy, because you always want to make your auditors happy. Okay, that concludes the formal presentation today. There's a lot more I could have talked about. We may end up doing a kind of grants budgeting 2 or grants budgeting 3 to focus on some of these areas in a lot more detail. I know that there are a couple of my colleagues here today, since I am traveling and have recorded this presentation previously, and my colleagues, I believe, can answer questions and provide more detail on what I talked about today. So anyway, I hope this was useful to you, and you may also feel free to contact me at Mohonk Preserve if you have other questions. I'd be very happy to help you with any budget questions you might have, and I wish you luck in creating the best grants that you can. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Maureen, for showing that. Thank you all for giving us a little bit of grace on doing the recording. We've never done that before. We did test it a few times. I think it went okay. I hope you could hear. Eric did, I think, a great job. You know, he was trying to keep you all engaged. He really wanted to be here, wasn't able to do that. So he, you know, picked out all of those, you know, bright and active visuals. But he also had a ton of good, I think, budgeting information. Some basic things, some things that I didn't know. Hopefully you learned something. How about questions? You can unmute yourself if you kind of give me a wave, or you can type it into the chat. But I might not see everyone. I see Catherine Quinn.
Excuse me, I had to unmute. I'm sorry. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Would anyone here be able to give a little direction? For our organization offers free support services to people dealing with breast, ovarian, gynecological cancer. Our 3 counselors are directly involved with our programs, but we also have the support staff that, you know, is involved in answering phones or, you know, working on promoting the project, etc. How do you put that into a grant to, you know, justify that you need those people to help support the program? Because I feel like in the past, we've often understated our project and our program costs? Can anyone address that and help us out with that?
So Catherine, I can start. I'm sure Lydia has some good recommendations on this as well. We have that same problem at CHF, and a lot of it comes down to our grant management. Because so much of what we do is we just estimate the amount of time that those people spend on that project, and we add it into the personnel costs. So if let's say your helpline is taking 100 calls a day, right? And 5 of them or 10 of them are related to that project, you can then say 10% of that person's time is spent on that program.
Okay. Yeah. See, our entire program is counseling and wellness. So it's very hard for us in the work that we do to break it up into compartments. And that, I think, is our challenge. So because we're very short staffed and, very much everything is involved in the whole program. So it becomes a bit challenging. So I guess what you're saying is we just kind of estimate, like what we did do recently. I kind of looked at my audit. Is that how I thought that to be helpful, where we broke down how much is related to program and how much is related. But just along that line, and I'm asking this question, I think it might be helpful to everybody. How do you deal with your fundraising costs? Because any fundraising you're doing is for the program, but is that all considered fundraising and none of that could go to program? Can anyone address that issue as well?
Okay, I'm going to jump in. Let me go back. I agree with what Maureen said and what I've seen with most of my clients, as you know. Hi, Catherine, by the way. I know Catherine a long time.
Yeah,
good to see you.
Long time.
Most of my clients have actually put in like program administration or program administer, comma, and then you put in, 5% of their salary or X amount of hours, and they're up on the top under salaries. They do that. As far as marketing goes, you mentioned marketing. You can it's certainly acceptable for almost any program to have a marketing director. Again, 5% of their hour time, and put them. The other thing about marketing, you can put marketing lower down as if it was one of your expenses, and then just bury the cost of the person, lower on the budget, where you have occupancy and phone and that stuff. You can put marketing and kind of bury the cost there. I will tell you that in the almost 25 years of writing grants, grant writing and development costs are not really, they're pretty well frowned upon as far as an expense goes for programs. It's a pre-award expense. I don't include them, to be honest with you, because I think it just red flags it that you're trying to throw everything into this, where they're looking, if it's a program ask, if it's an operational ask, that may be different. But for a program ask, I would actually be hesitant to put in, development director with X amount of hours. That's like an overall agency expense, in my opinion. Maybe some other people put it in, but I wouldn't do that.
So just, I agree with everything Lydia said. And again, I think it goes to the funder. Know your funder. But I have found, we have actually had really good luck putting in our grants manager who manages the reporting out, right? So not the writing, but we've actually had some really good luck putting in a little bit of that person's time for their reporting and setting up meetings. So more of like an administrative role for the grant. So
you could call that evaluation consultant.
Yep.
Because we are handling that evaluation as really the report. So if you want to quote bury the name, you could put it as an evaluation, and then put
Jeff,
your.
Sorry, go ahead, Lydia.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I just want to comment on the chat. Jeff and Marcy kind of agreed with you guys. They're saying, sort of added into sustainability planning efforts, and Marcy puts it in as an indirect cost, which can all sort of fall under that umbrella. So yeah, that's where I usually put it as well.
Now accounting, we didn't mention that one, but that's another one too, because there's accounting for the overall agency, but then there may be accounting, bookkeeping work that is specifically related to your program. So, that's certainly legitimate. I've often put it up at the top, under the salary section. put in accounting for bookkeeping, services. Now, when in doubt, Catherine, add a second column. I mean, it's nice you have your categories, but then add a second column that would be either justification or calculations. So you can put in the second column things like bookkeeping. It's intense bookkeeping for this program because there's 22 therapists that need to be tracked. Then it's a completely legitimate understanding to why you put the accountant up there. You follow me? So a lot of people do that extra column, and then you can do a match column and then the final budget, or in kind column. There's no reason just to have the two columns. You can spread it out and create columns like justification, calculations. You can add, for most part, do whatever you want to do if they don't provide you with your own, with their own form for you to fill out.
Well, I guess, and again, if there's other agencies on that are primarily, like we're primarily counseling and everything related to that. So when you're doing, according to these things, we've come up with a budget that really is, like when we look at the program in the past, we've had maybe that program cost on paper only looks about a third of what the budget is, yet we're very lean and mean. So I guess I don't know, then to me that could be a turn off to say, well, why would we, what are they doing with all the other money in the budget? But we're not, everything is supporting those programs. And that's where I think it becomes very, very challenging. And, I've been on other webinars just, to share that, say, now we have to kind of shift the way all this is being presented to talk more about the actual cost to deliver the program. But I don't know if funders are shifting that thinking. It doesn't sound like they are right now. So it's a challenge, I think. Whereas I think if you have multiple programs that you could break things up, I think it's probably a little bit more, involved, easier than when you have one main that is everything you do.
Yeah. And also the point is your budgets. Really think out of the box as what it takes to do this. A program is not just the salary of that consultant that runs the program for you. There is phone, there's office space. They're taking up space, or say in your office, the internet, you add up all of these costs in addition to program supplies. I have to tell you, numerous times I've gotten a budget from a client. The budget is $25,000, and when I'm done with it, that budget is $75,000. And you know what? I give it to them, and they look at it and they say, "You're absolutely right, Lydia. All of those expenses should be considered in the budget. It is cost, electric, oil, heating, whatever it is. If they're taking up space in the office doing it, and it could be a program expense. It's not all just overhead.
Mm-hmm.
So make your budgets bigger and include some of these things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, just to bring, you mentioned something about funders. I will tell you, when I started, 10% was the rule of thumb for admin. They've come a long way. Even Eric mentioned in the video that, it's like 35% now, up to, in some, government grants. I still try to keep it to 15 or 20%. I try not to show that admin being so much. I think there's just an aversion to paying for admin, but you can legitimately consider these costs. Electric, a certain percentage of the electric going to those 3 staff people. What percentage of the electric bill could be attributed to their time in their office, using the internet? I'm not going to say 50%, but it's certainly legitimate to take 5 or 10% and consider it part of that program.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And Allison is sort of backing what you were just saying, Lydia, about being an advocate for talking about core operating costs and making sure you add that in so that funders know that those are there. We all know we have those overhead costs, and funders don't love funding them, but they are there. And I think reminding them and being an advocate as a grant professional that, you know, someone has to pay for these, and, you know, they're not the sexy things, but you know, someone
Right,
does have to
right.
pay to keep the
And
lights on.
to
And so,
soften it a little, I call it softening. But you know, when you put admin and then you want to put 15%, but spell out, put e.g. what the admin is, overall supervision, accounting, auditing, legal. It's all the things that you didn't spell out above, you know, and take a percentage of it. But that overhead, you know, spell it out so that
Yeah.
there's no question for the funder.
so, and that, Eric talked about that grant detail. How much detail do you want to put in there? You know, I always feel like I over detail things, but you know, it sounds like
No.
sometimes you have to. Okay, I want to make sure we get to, I saw Marcy had her hand raised, and I see Jean Pellet has her hand raised. So Marcy, let's go first with you. Do you want to unmute, or are you typed?
Great, thank you. Hi. Hi,
Hi.
everybody. Sorry, I'm joining from my car in a parking lot right now. Thank you so much for this webinar. This was really interesting and informative. One new thing that we talked about that was new to me is regarding the net gain to the organization. So I appreciate the way that Eric talked about the different kinds of budgets, kind of using the same information, but just presenting it in different columns. I understand, and I like the idea of here's the total program cost. Here is what we had anticipated in the budget. And then here's the new expenses in a new column to say, here's why we're reaching out. But it seemed to me like and I joined a couple minutes late, so I may have missed. I felt like I didn't understand how the numbers matched up to get net gain. And I was wondering if anybody else followed that and could maybe give me a little bit of insight. Are we then going to the funder to say, here's the change in our original anticipated budget, or here's the new expense, this is how the program is growing, and that's why we're looking to you for additional funding, and that dollar amount would be different? I don't know if anybody else had thoughts around that.
So, Marcy, for me, we don't call it net gain at CHF. We call it intermittent costs, right? So these are things that we want to do, but we don't have the money for at the moment. And we don't know where the money's going to come from. So if we put it into a grant and we get it, then it happens, right? So I think that's the way to think about it. It's not that the program has it. It's just that these are things, you know, so I'm going to use Eric's example. If they're doing programs and all of a sudden their projector dies midway through the year, they need to find a funder to pay for a new projector, right? They didn't anticipate that. So I think those are the things that, like, to me, it's a net gain. I don't think of it as a net gain so much as these are intermittent costs that I would only expend if I get the money for them.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks, Maureen. Appreciate it.
Okay. And Jean, did you want to take yourself off mute and ask your question?
Yes. Thank you very much. So I have a budget question. We have a financial literacy program for high school students in New York City, and a lot of our funders are the big banks. And some of these funders want to come in and talk to kids in our high schools about personal finance, about careers in finance, and so forth, which is fantastic. But I've been asked to call this out in the budget because it takes considerable time sometimes to schedule these visits, to go back and forth between the schools and the executives and employees at these banks. So I'll have a budget line that says, scheduling time for scheduling school visits. But I worry sometimes that a funder will say, well, we're giving you our volunteer time, and now you're charging us basically in our budget to do it. And I just wondered if anyone has an opinion about that.
Would that be considered matching, even though there's a cost to the organization to do all of that? But if you need to prove matching funds, would that be considered like the equivalent of the cost of those individuals, the time, not the people who are working for you, but the people who are coming in from the banks? There's a value to their time. So could you use that hourly rate or the equivalent as matching? That doesn't really help with your costs, but if you did have this requirement to provide matching funds, could that be considered matching?
Not sure. I haven't generally done budgets with a matching the way that he had, that he I haven't generally done that in budgets.
Okay, so I will tell you an example I have that may solve your problem. Instead of putting the title of the people, you can do it by function. And something like Eileen there was talking about, she could put therapy instead, and then put a certain amount of hours. So maybe put literacy coordination, and describe time to coordinate the entire program, $5,000. You know what I mean? So that is a legitimate expense. Someone is taking time out of their day, their hours, and do it that way rather than the person's title.
Right. But this is just a small amount of the budget. Basically, they're giving a whole bunch of money to fund the program. And this is just like a small portion of it. So I don't know if I'd want to go into that much detail.
Okay.
You could also just call it site visit expense, which I do often because we're a national organization. So sometimes if I have a funder who wants to do a site visit in Arizona, there's travel costs associated with that. So we do put that in. And to Lydia's point, we don't necessarily put it under staffing or personnel costs, but we put it in kind of part of the programmatic, because the site visit is part of the program costs.
Right.
So.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Great suggestions. Thanks, Maureen and Lydia. And Helene, yes, our organization always calculates any kind of, volunteer hours that can be used as part of a match. So I say add that in. If you could potentially add that in. We use the independent sectors, calculation, their algorithm or calculator. They do it by state, but I'm sure there are plenty out there. So absolutely add to that match. Anyone else with questions? I'm looking through to see if anyone has their hand raised or wants to. Feel free to just unmute yourself. Just really, Deborah?
I guess I just want to say that it's important also to, when it's relevant, to note the value in addition to volunteer time, anything that's in kind, because it is a true program cost. It's a way that organizations fund things by getting in-kind services or in-kind supplies, and you can use that toward a match, or sometimes, just like Lydia was saying, have a column, because I think sometimes funders really appreciate seeing that you are doing everything you can to get everything covered for this program. They want to know that you're not only relying on them for funding.
Yeah, and in addition to putting it on the expense, the in-kind column, it should always be up in your income. And I'll give you an example. I have a food pantry. They bring in over $1 million of donated food. That has got to be up at the top under the income. That's a substantial amount of the money. And I'm looking for the shortfall with the grants, kind of thing. By the way, I'm going to share something a gazillion years ago. A funder, it was on a panel, and I always remember this. The funder said the first thing they do is look at the budget before even opening up the grant. I mean, if they have a checklist, they would check if you actually qualify, but they go right to the budget. And the reason being is they want to see if it overall makes sense. If it's a girls' basketball team or whatever, they don't want to see computers in there, so they go right to that, unless there's a justification for having the computer for the basketball team. And I always remember that. That's why my budgets, I really spell them out. They see it. I give them more. I actually put things like, for instance, I wrote a note here for personnel, 10% of their time, 1 FTE or 0.5 FTE, or the number of hours times the number of weeks. I spell it up, 10% of their 100,000 salary. I, even with FICA benefits, I put them all down. FICA, workers' comp, health, medical, retirement. And now, of course, they have the New York commuter tax. 7.65%. I put the calculation. So because benefits, is it just FICA, or are you giving the person medical and retirement as well? So by just adding those little notes, and by the way, look at it this way. for a regular nonprofit organization, you only have, say, maybe 5 programs. So you're creating like only 5 budgets, you know what I mean? So spend the time to really do a good solid budget and you'll have it for a very long time. And once a year you have to update it with the new salaries, right? But I'm a big believer in the more is better. It answers questions. It screams, I know what I'm doing. This organization is someone that you can give money to because they're going to spend it wisely.
I love that. Thank you, Lydia. That was gonna be my question. How detailed? I tend to go over detail, but it sounds like you've been trained by the federal government well by putting in those exact, FICA numbers and all of that. I know that it is 12:59 and I want to say thank you for joining us. And hopefully we can have Eric back for a part 2 on this. I know there are a lot of others with budgeting. Thank you all so much for joining. I feel like it was great. I'm going to stay on. I'm not sure that Lydia and Maureen have a couple minutes. If you do have questions, feel free to stay. We can continue our conversation. We could probably talk a long time, but I see that other people have things to do. But thank you all for joining us, bearing with us on the recording and everything else. And we hope to see you in April with our next programs. Deborah, you can stop recording unless we want to keep it going for those who are missing any more discussion that we might have. Totally up to you.
That's what I'm thinking, just because I don't know if anybody else is, it looks like some people are staying on. I did have one comment just to add to something Lydia was saying, in terms of when you're crafting those budgets, really important to look at what you've got in your audit and make sure that there isn't some big disconnect between the budget you're putting together and what it says in your audit or your 990, because they will catch it. And it's important to have it in your budget narrative. You can say, hey, we had in 2023 the remnants of this big PPP loan, and we don't have that anymore. We had to spend it because, XYZ. Don't make them guess. Connect the dots for them. What happened between your last audit and now that is reflected in your budget numbers. So I just wanted to add that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a very strange grant writer where I write my budget first because I like to know where to put the narrative. And then the biggest chunk of the budget is where I talk about more in the narrative. But I know I'm more of a numbers person. So it's kind of a strange thing.
The one thing we didn't bring up, and it's so true, over the years, I found it very hard to just do a equipment grant. Like his example was $10,000 we needed for computers. It was very hard. I've had way more success with what Eric did. Build it into the program, describe the program, and the ask is for the 10,000 for the computers for the kids. I forgot to mention that, but that's just from experience, that's worked better for me.
And I think Eric did a good job of sort of explaining how he does that. But yes, I also agree. Yeah.
Does anybody else? We have some people here. Anybody have some questions?
Yeah. Take yourself.
Carol at Locust Grove.
Carol, yeah, you're on mute.
I'm new to this whole game, so all the great information that I gathered today is really helping me get a handle on how to approach grants for Locust Grove. Thank you so much.
Well, welcome to
Locust Grove.
Yeah,
because last week we had a lovely Women's United luncheon there with My
Yes,
United
you
Way.
did.
And so
Yeah, and
thank you very much. Lovely space. Yes.
And I was in the back room being voted as president of the board, which was unexpected for me, but I was very happy.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lydia
and
and
we
Maureen.
got a couple consultants here. Mary and Noah, did you agree with what I was saying, or?
I would, yeah, I found it very interesting because I'm a consultant. I'm dealing with a lot of different approaches to budgets. Generally, I'm provided with the budget as opposed to generating it on my own, but I definitely give feedback as appropriate and that sort of thing. And I would, ideally, as I grow my practice, I would like to be more involved in the budget making because I do definitely understand how valuable it is for grant seeking. And like you said, Lydia, like how I had also heard from someplace that they look at the budget first, almost first, you know?
Yeah.
Because it does, it's such, for people who like numbers, it really explains a lot.
Yeah.
So
You know,
that's,
as grant writers, we'd like to think that it's not our job to
Mm.
create the budget, that it should come to us from every accounting office.
right,
But I will tell you, probably 95% of the time, I actually create the budget because they don't have it. They don't
Mhm.
have, the woman was talking about literacy. They have their youth services budget. They do not have a literacy program budget or the camp budget because they're all lumped into the one youth budget. I'm the
right.
one that takes it out and looks at the salaries and breaks it down. I'm going to say it's like 95% of the budgets I do, you know, and to tell you the truth, I'd rather do it than having the accountant do it because they want to have 25% of their admin covered. And that's just not reality. I need to put it under the other categories to bury it. To be
Yes.
honest with you, it ain't gonna fly with a
Right.
funder saying 25%. What are these people doing over there at the United Way? They don't know what they're doing. Their admin's too high. Fire that
Exactly.
Michelle person.
That's right.
Oh, no.
I remember the first time I went, this was years ago, but I started a job and I was writing a grant and I asked for the program budget. And they just gave me the overall organizational budget with the big ticket. They had not broken it down. They didn't even know like kind of where all the expenses really were. It took us, 3 weeks to kind of figure all that out. And then, but yeah, from that point on, I was like, that's it. I need to start taking more of take charge more
Take
of the
charge.
budgets. Yeah,
Not only that, but my finance team doesn't really know our funders.
no.
My team knows our funders. And
Yeah.
just knowing what they expect in there and, how they like things laid out. And not only that, my finance team certainly didn't read that 80-page RFP from New York State, and highlighted all of the different things that we are allowed to add in the budget,
Not
what's
allowed.
not allowed, all of that. And so I'm the same thing. I just tend to do it myself with their input, of course,
Yeah, I forgot to mention that. I always send it to the finance person to look at. And they always rubber stamp it because they know I know what I'm talking about and that this is your best chance of getting that 10,000 for the equipment,
Also for small organizations that don't have a finance department, you're working with the program people and it takes a little training, in terms of, because the program people are so used to having to scrimp and save and they want everything to look like it's less than it is. So you have to work with them to say, we have got to get you money to do this. That means we have to understand really what this costs, everything that's involved. Don't say like, oh, I'm going to do it this way so I can cut off my left finger in order to make myself smaller, all that stuff. What does it really cost? What does it really take? What do you cost? How many hours? Don't leave out all this stuff. Let's put it all in and do it the way that you're saying.
You know
Lydia.
what? I've made a few program people happy and I've asked them a question. If we were to get you $10,000, what would you spend it on? I want you to get back to me with the list of things, or at least by category. Their eyes open. And that's what I need to put in. That's what I need.
That's when it comes out that they're using a program that shuts itself down every time they open it and they have to, try and open it 17 times or whatever it is, and yeah, that's
Michelle, are you looking for software support? Is that what?
I need it.
You
Can you
need a
tell
new
that's where my
computer?
brain is?
Well, that's a
Well,
great approach.
Yes.
It's like, what are your
yes.
3 wishes? You're the genie, and the grant writers are the genie in the bottle.
Right. I've got $10,000 in that bottle.
We don't want what Eric's old boss said, the grants are the gifts that keep taking. I wrote that down. We don't want that. Want to make sure it's bringing impact to the positive impact to the
Yeah.
programs for sure.
Yeah, we got it. Anybody else? We got a bunch of new people here. Hi, Ruth and Bob and Ron and Jorel. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that.
I have a question that's off topic now, but it's as a member, I actually had somebody who approached me about a job in the Westchester area. It's actually Riverdale, so a little south. And it's a development manager job. Is that like something I can like post to the group? Because obviously people in this group know people who might be looking for that sort of job, but it seems like it's only paid notices. Is that correct?
No, you can send it to the job banks. Post it on the job, to be posted on our job banks. You just
Oh,
need
okay.
to send it to the GPLH at, right? Deborah?
It's
all
on the
sudden
Yes, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. You can send it to info.gplh@gmail.com.
Okay.
And then we do have a couple of wonderful board members who will review your material. There's also a place on our website that tells you exactly what's needed, what has to go into a job posting.
Oh, okay.
You know,
All right.
all
Very
the
good.
information that's needed. So just check out the website, and that also has, you know, the email address. Send it to us at info.gplh@gmail.com.
Okay,
And we will
thank you
take
so
care of you.
much. Great, thank you.
Absolutely. So I'm wondering if I should stop recording. Does anybody else have any questions? Hearing nothing, I'm going to stop recording.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming. And this was a great
All right.
presentation, great Q&A. So grateful to
Thank-
have you,
Thank you.
Lydia
Thanks
and
for
Maureen.
having
Lydia.
me. You
Michelle.
got it. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Everyone.